Thank you very much, Ian, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I don't have any pictures for you, so I'm afraid you're just going to have to listen for the next 15 minutes or so, or not, as the case may be. It's your choice. Very much into choice here today. But I've been asked to talk about some of the criminal aspects that arise in the context of what we're discussing. We've had some very good discussion during the course of the morning about some of the civil law issues that arise, and Colleen Cartwright in her presentation has referred to some of the civil instruments that you should definitely take into account and prepare. I'm looking at a slightly different aspect of the matter altogether. I'm looking at the conduct that surrounds the point of death, or leads up to the point of death, and some of that conduct that might render people liable to criminal sanctions. Criminal law applies, of course, when you do something naughty and the authorities become involved, basically. And that can lead to investigations by the authorities. It can lead to prosecution, it can lead to penalties being imposed. And the kind of conduct that is the subject of the criminal law is that conduct that the community generally, that society regards as sufficiently reprehensible as to require official state sanction and intervention to enforce the rules that have been made in respect of those matters. And there's a real issue about the involvement of the criminal law in these issues at all, when the criminal law should be applied, and to what extent the criminal law should intervene in the conduct of people leading up to the point of death. And what I have to say will lead into the discussion of the other two speakers in this panel about assisted dying. Now, there are a number of ways of describing what happens. It's sometimes called voluntary euthanasia, medically assisted death, assisted suicide, and so on. But the expression that I favour is voluntary assisted dying. Now, I don't have a patent on that expression, but it just seems to me to incorporate the three elements that are under consideration when we talk about this. The first is that it is voluntary, being the product of informed consent. Or an expression I heard for the first time in morning tea from one of those present, informed commitment, which I thought was a rather nice way of capturing what is involved. But more generally, the expression informed consent is used. That is, free and voluntary agreement to the action that will end that person's life. The second word is assisted. Assisted death, involving the conduct of another party, whose position must then be appropriately protected to avoid criminal liability for that person's conduct. And dying. Dying by the ending of one's own life by oneself, even if another party assists or is the agent providing the cause of death, the direct cause of death. Now, it's actually suicide, the killing of oneself. But for understandable reasons, the word suicide is something that debaters in this area generally avoid. So I think probably dying describes what happens, and it's voluntary and it's assisted. Now, as we've heard, and as many of you will know, there was a bill put before this Parliament recently by the Greens Party, which was not successful. But during the discussion phase of that bill, I certainly examined it pretty thoroughly. I made a few modest suggestions for perhaps improvement here and there in relation to some details, but I thought that the bill covered the field pretty well. The structure of what was anticipated by the legislation was pretty sound. The safeguards were there, and I thought that that kind of approach was certainly defensible from the point of view of the protection of human rights of all involved and the avoidance of criminal liability by those involved in taking these actions. But without legislation of that kind, there are three criminal offences that can arise for consideration in the conduct of people towards the dying. The first offence is murder, and it deals with the situation where the person causing death or administering the cause of death intended to kill or to do grievous bodily harm or was reckless as to the causing of death, having turned his or her mind to that probability. Now, when we talk about murder, that is the most serious offence in the criminal calendar, but it's an offence that can arise very easily or raise its prospect very easily in the context of what we're talking about. Because, for example, a person administering to another a drug with the intention that the drug should end that person's life and the person dies, that is murder, pure and simple. There's no avoiding it. It's a brutal reality, and the person who takes that action is liable for everything that flows from the commission of the crime of murder. And it doesn't matter who that person is, whether it be a doctor, a nurse, a family member, a friend, a carer. The identity of the person is irrelevant, and it doesn't matter what the person who dies wished to have happen. You cannot consent to be killed in a way that excuses your killer from criminal liability. There are other things you can consent to that might not be pleasant, but you cannot consent to being killed as a matter of law. So it doesn't matter what the victim wants to have happen. The person who takes that action is guilty of murder. The second offence that might arise is the offence of manslaughter, which happens in the case of all other homicides other than murder and infanticide and suicide. And it arises where the action that the person takes is unlawful and dangerous, or where the action that the person takes is exceedingly negligent. And it's possible for the offence of manslaughter to arise in this context, but it's pretty unusual, and you'd have to think pretty hard to work out the factual circumstances that might give rise to it. The other offence that needs to be considered is suicide. Suicide is not actually a criminal offence anymore. There weren't a lot of prosecutions. It was a criminal offence, and it was a criminal offence at a time when the Christian church had a much more powerful input into the formation of criminal laws than is presently the case, because it was regarded as sinful and therefore should be criminal. But there are other offences connected with it. The offence of attempted suicide is still on the books. So if you're not successful in killing yourself, you can be prosecuted for trying to kill yourself. Again, there don't seem to be a lot of prosecutions for that offence. You certainly don't read about them on the front page of the Daily Telegraph. But it should be said, I think, in this context, that the deliberate refusal of treatment, as has been referred to this morning, is not an offence, regardless of the consequences that might flow from it. So It's connected with the idea of consent, with the idea that people can only do things to you if you agree for them to be done to you. But aiding and abetting suicide, or even attempted suicide, are also still serious offences. And they carry maximum penalties of 10 years imprisonment. Aiding suicide, abetting suicide, or even attempted suicide. They are criminal offences. And even inciting or counselling suicide, as a consequence of which the person commits suicide or attempts to, carries 5 years imprisonment. So this kind of encouragement that might be given to people can also open people up to criminal liability under the offences of aiding, abetting, inciting or counselling suicide or attempted suicide. So you can see that there are some serious criminal offences that might arise, and I haven't got into the area of offences against the person that might be caused if death does not result from the action that's taken. I can give you an example, and I'm looking at the time, and I'm going to end with this story, because it demonstrates, I think, some of the issues and some of the difficulties that are faced not only by medical personnel, health workers of one sort and another, but also by others in the community, such as police officers, prosecutors, the courts, and the families of the deceased. And it's a story that I'll cut short. It's a story that received a lot of publicity at the time, a few years ago, and it's the story of a family that some of you may know already. But I think it illustrates the very difficult position that a lot of people are placed in by reason of the existing framework of laws that surrounds voluntary or voluntary assisted dying. The story concerns an elderly couple from the Central Coast who had enjoyed a very long and loving marriage, and over time the wife became progressively ill and incapacitated by a serious and incurable disease. It would eventually kill her. Everybody knew that. Everybody was resigned to that fact. But it would do so only after many, many years of increasing suffering and incapacity. She had reached the stage where she was physically disabled. She was unable to stand, to walk, to get out of bed unaided, and she required constant care for all her needs. These are people in their early 70s that I'm talking about. And her husband gave up work many years before to become her sole carer. They were very closely committed to each other. And the wife frequently begged that she be relieved from her suffering as the condition deteriorated. And one night, after yet another such request, the husband gave the wife some sleeping tablets that they had been hoarding from tablets that had been prescribed by their doctor. And she eventually went to sleep. Before that, they said goodbye to each other. And when she was asleep, he placed a pillow over her face and she suffocated. He called the doctor, who had been expecting her death at any time from this progressive disease, and in fact was surprised that she had survived for so long. And the doctor came round, certified that she had died of the disease. Arrangements were made for cremation, And then the husband went off to visit their children who were living in other places, New Zealand, England. He came home after a few weeks, and a day after his return to Sydney, walked into the Gosford police station and told them what he had done. Now, you know, I think that there are messages in there for everybody. Extraordinary action on the part of this man. And of course the police were confronted with this man who had come to the desk at the police station and confessed to the crime of murder, because that's what he had done. Now, police do have some discretion, very limited discretion, as to the charges that they can bring against people who commit criminal offences. But there wasn't much way out of this one. He sat down and he told them at length all the things that had happened, the lead up to it, what he had actually done, the involvement of the doctor and a priest after the death. So he was charged with murder. They fortunately released him on bail. He was unlikely to be dangerous to to society. And eventually the matter came before the court. Now, at that time, I was the Director of Public Prosecutions for this state. And I became responsible for the conduct of the criminal proceedings against him. And I had to make a decision about what should be done with this man charged with murder, the most serious offence in the criminal calendar. And ultimately, and in consultation with his lawyers, I agreed that we would accept a plea of guilty to assisted suicide rather than proceed with a murder charge or any other alternative charge. It was dealt with in the local court at Gosford, and he was put on a bond to be of good behaviour for 12 months. Now, the point of telling you the story is that these sorts of issues go well beyond health professionals. These sorts of issues, in a case like that, and that case is not unique, it's just one that sticks in my mind and I think will forever. The people who have to deal with these situations are placed in very difficult positions indeed. The police, the prosecutors, the court, how are these things going to be resolved? So the ramifications are wider than just the people who are caring for the terminally ill. So those are some of the criminal law aspects that do arise and have arisen and no doubt will continue to arise until, at least in my view, we get some sensible laws about this. Thank you.